Welcome back to our morning devotions, and we continue our studies on revival. And today we're going to think about what is called the Great Awakening, the revival in America in the 1730s, 1740s. It was a period when there was a great deadness in the church. There had been prosperity in the American colonies, things had been going well there. And with that prosperity, there was a less of a desire and hunger for the things of God. And it's often the case when people become comfortable with the things of this world, the things of the world to come become less important. So that was the situation. People were very comfortable, which led to churches being filled with so many people who were nominal members, people who didn't have a genuine relationship with Jesus. And indeed, some of the ministers, a lot of the ministers, that would be their case as well in those days. Another deadening impact on those times, it was a time of the Enlightenment, where reasoning was very much in the forefront. And so, again, that was turning people away from the whole perspective of faith. But then things began to change. There was bit by bit a return to biblical preaching. Theodore Frelinghuysen, a Dutch Reformed pastor, he would have travelled around on horseback and preached very strongly for the need of salvation, the need to be born again. A Presbyterian called William Tennant in Pennsylvania, he began a new seminary for training young men for the ministry. It was called the Log College. And really, basically what he did was he opened up his home. And unlike other places where people study for the ministry, William Tennant had a place with a great emphasis on people's personal saving relationship with Jesus Christ. That was what was required of those going into the ministry. Sadly, sometimes many went into ministry just as a profession. Some in the wealthy families, one son would go into the military, one son would go into the ministry. And that's not the way it should be. And Tennant was very influential in saying that ministers needed to be those who are born again, have a relationship with Christ. And that's what he emphasised in training ministers. Training a generation of ministers where they are spiritually was the most important thing. At that time, there came, or just before that, in 1727, there came to Northampton a great preacher called Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards is regarded as one of the greatest minds that America has ever produced. He was a great intellect. His ministry was very intellectual. He would have spent 13 hours a day studying. His sermons were not dramatic. His sermons were very much reasoned argument, long sermons. He wrote them out and he read his sermons. And there was nothing particularly exciting about the way he did this. But in his ministry, the Spirit of God breathed upon him. And a great work of the Spirit was beginning in that Northampton area. And over a period of 6 months, he speaks about 300 souls who would come to faith. Although he wasn't a very dramatic preacher, God's Spirit was coming and using the truth that he was declaring to change people's lives. One sermon that he preached was probably his most famous sermon, were sinners in the hand of an angry God. He was a man who preached the full counsel of God. He preached the truth about the character of God. He preached the truth about sin and judgment, the truth about salvation and rebirth. And so, under Edwards' ministry and others who are now faithful ministers, God was moving in power. One of the things that Edwards emphasized was that the importance of people having a genuine relationship with Christ, a genuine faith in Christ before they became church members. That wasn't the way it was before. but it's one of the things he emphasised. And indeed, it's one of the things that really got him in bother in his ministry at one stage. But he was a man who was faithful to God's truth, and God blessed him. Another person of great significance in this revival that was happening here on the eastern coast of America was George Whitefield. We have already considered him, how at Cambuslang in Scotland he was used there. The great revival in the evangelical revival in England in the 1730s and 40s was used, and then he was also used in America. He travelled up and down the east coast. People made fun of him. People mocked him. Some people indeed made fun of how he had a squint in his eye. But he was different. We spoke about Edwards, how he wrote and read his sermons. Whitefield was an extemporary preacher. He didn't have notes. He just preached as he indeed was led by God. And well, many of his sermons he would have preached many times, so he could have done that. But he was different. This not being tied to your notes was not what people were used to. And indeed it had a tremendous impact, and he drew crowds of many, many thousands came to listen to him. But the revival was not without opposition. Indeed, some saw Whitefield just as someone who was out for the money, but he would have took offerings at his meetings, but it was for orphanages that he had founded in the colonies. Those who opposed Whitefield within the church were called the Old Light, and many of them hadn't time for him. They were some were jealous of him, some were uncomfortable because he was shaking things up. But many who did embrace him were called the New Light. They came and they saw what God was doing, and they were willing to be part of it. One of the very important things in this revival in America was the use of printed material. Printing had now come in, and Benjamin Franklin, who is a famous name in American history, he was involved in printing. They printed sermons, they printed some of Martin Luther's books. What some people did was they just gathered their friends and neighbours round to their house and would have read some of these sermons to them, and churches were founded by that. Hundreds of new churches were formed because of this great awakening across the United States. God was moving in power. God was transforming the lives of so many of these early American people. God was doing a great work of grace. In the meetings, whether it was Whitefield, whether it was Jonathan Edwards, whoever, there's a great sense of God, a great sense of conviction came over the people. God was doing a work, and the people were being blessed and filled with joy. We need to pray for such days that God will move in great power and transform our community. Amen.